Hello and welcome to En Route, a journey of faith and modern life. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Well, if you know anything about economics, it has to be about the concept of scarcity. This is the concept where you're dealing with a gap between a limited resource and unlimited wants. Scarcity means making decisions on how to best allocate these resources efficiently so that as many people benefit as possible. That's basically what scarcity is all about. It's econ 101. But when I got to seminary and afterwards, I would hear pastors say over and over again that scarcity was bad. They would say things like God is a God of abundance and that scarcity was about greed and about not sharing resources with others. I never understood where other pastors were getting this. I knew about this basic fact of economics. So why were they coming up with this alternative viewpoint? What I learned over time was that this sort of thinking was pretty standard throughout mainline Protestantism. My guest today thinks that way too many clergy in mainline Protestantism are somewhat ignorant when it comes to economics, in the same way that sometimes evangelicals are ignorant when it comes to science. Why is that? The economist I have today is Michael Kruse, and I think he's made it his work over the last few years or so to really help Christians in mainline churches really understand how economics really works. He's used his blog, Kruse Chronicle, to help allow people of faith to really understand economics and how it can be used that is beneficial and that coincides with one's faith. So today Michael and I are going to be chatting about economics, business, and the mainline Protestant church. We will also be talking a little bit about evangelicals and why it seems sometimes within evangelicalism there is such a hard time of people understanding structural racism. I've really been looking forward to this episode, so I hope that this is going to be an experience where you will gain some knowledge, especially on such an important topic. Here's Michael Kruse. Well, it's good to talk to you, Mike.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Dennis.
Well, the first thing that I wanted to bring about was to talk a little bit about the concept of scarcity. That was, to me, kind of basic economics that I learned in high school and later in college. And I've noticed over the years when I was in seminary, but even not just in seminary, but in other places, how much scarcity seemed to be a bad thing. And to me, it didn't make any sense because that was kind of the basic understanding of what economics was all about. It's kind of like saying oxygen is bad. So can you kind of explain or kind of bring about kind of what has been the issue concerning scarcity and what does it actually mean in economics when we talk about scarcity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I back up and say a little bit from a theological standpoint. When I hear the corporate prayers on Sunday, or I see various pastors or theologians writing, they talk about needing to live out of a spirit of abundance, not a spirit of scarcity. And that economists and business people will tell you that you need to live your life out of a feeling of scarcity, that there's always want, there's always need, but we need to resist that and embrace abundance. And so that's the theological perspective that's there. And there is a strong element of truth in that. and that our trust is to be in God, and that we are to trust God for provision, and that I guess the question then is, the assumption seems to be there that the abundance pre-exists, and all that has to be done is for it to be redistributed, to appropriately distributed, so that people do not experience scarcity. That often seems to be the underlying thought behind the theologian that I hear talking. Is that true? Is there an abundance? And so the way I would look at this is, if you look around, almost anything in your office or anything around you, almost everything that you see did not exist the way you are using it. It does not exist the way it existed in nature. Somebody had to harvest something. They had to gather goods and combine them together and take them from less useful forms and put them in more useful forms in order for us to be able to use those things, which means there's human labor. And if you look around your office, there's almost nothing there that exists the way that it exists in nature, which means that abundance of things that you have was created by human action, by human interaction. So if you're talking about abundance in terms of the things that we actually use in everyday life, there's a near absolute scarcity of everything. Human labor somehow has to transform that into more useful forms. And so then the question is, how does that happen? How does that occur? And what are the just ways for that occur? What are the most beneficial ways for that to occur? Those are the questions that I think we get into. All economics is saying is making the obvious, a rather obvious thing, if you think about it for a second, that virtually nothing we use exists in nature. And so therefore, things have to be fabricated and transformed into more useful forms. And so how do human beings, how does society do that? And what are the options based on whatever values we're bringing to the table? Which are the better options in terms of how to create that abundance? So economics actually is about abundance. It's about, how does abundance occur? How do you create it? But my experience has been that in broad swaths of the church, that there is a lot of antagonism, or at least ambivalence, towards economics, towards business, towards that productive capacity. I could give some thoughts as to why I think some of that exists.
Well, I think that that's important to us, because I don't,
yeah,
we would never kind of, well, especially these days, we talk a lot about trusting the science, or talking about the importance of science. And, right. But it seems like sometimes in at least in mainline churches, it's like we don't trust economics and right. kind of the basic system of how we dole out resources. And so, I mean, I guess, why is that? What is what's behind all the antagonism?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know that I have the solid answer or the one solid answer to that, but just a couple of thoughts. I think one of the things that is a challenge is that through most of human history, economics was pretty much a fairly narrow zero-sum game. The way I benefit and the way I get wealthier is somebody else gets less wealthy. So the wealth is it's minimal, and there's barely enough to go around. But through most of humanity, the overwhelming majority of humanity lived barely at subsistence level. And so you were just struggling to survive through your entire life, just above subsistence. And so somebody become wealthy, the only two ways that you became wealthy was because you had land or because you had labor. And labor, you can't really increase the productivity over a certain level. I mean, there's marginal differences you can make. Land you can only make it so productive. So if those are your only two inputs in terms of creating wealth, then it's a relatively fixed sum game. And so when we look at ancient writers, which includes the writers of scripture and how they're looking at things, the issue is almost never about production per se. It's about distribution, because it is that relatively fixed sum game. And so biblical ethics, and I think the early church coming forward up until the recent couple of centuries, that was the world. That was the way things were. But in the past 200 years or so, through combinations of specialization of labor, through trade, and particularly using power to increase production, machine power, and then the energy that powers those machines, we have been able to radically alter the ability to produce things. And so that creates this tremendous abundance in which abroad, first it began in the West and it's began to expand to other parts of the world, in which a great many people, if not the whole world, can, by historic standards, can participate in abundance. They can have that wealth. Now there's serious issues, consequences, environmental issues. There's questions about climate change. There's all those kind of issues. So all of that has to be processed through an ethical framework. But I think what's different is that so much of the whole history and the weight of the church was fashioned in this fixed sum world that existed. And it seems to me that the church still has a hard time coming to grips and grappling with how the world has changed in the past couple of hundred years. I find very, very few theologians who have ever even had a class in economics, much less developed a competency in knowing what it is. And usually what they have developed often tends to be just enough to be able to say things to sort of reinforce the pejorative view that they have of economics in the first place. So there is a real need for us to think theologically about this new world that we live in. And it just seems to me that there is a dearth of that much of the church tends to be driven by, on the one side, sort of a very strong, at least in the United States, sort of this Christian nationalist, gung-ho, everything America is great, so therefore capitalism is wonderful, and our business people are the best and the most wonderful in the world, and nobody should criticize them. Or the other side is sort of the social justice side of things, and capitalism is exploitative. That's all that it is, and needs to be done away with, and we need socialism, and it just tends to follow. The church, to me, seems to follow two very populist strains, and I find, unfortunately, depressingly, only small pockets in the church, it seemed to me, that really try to struggle with wrestling about this issue of economics and faith. And let me also add to this, because I don't want to sound like this is all coming down on one side. Economics does have problems. The discipline of economics has issues. So I don't mean to hold them up as the paragon or the final authority on truth and morality. Going back nearly 100 years with Keynes and this idea that of Homo economicus, that human beings are just economic calculating machines. And basically, I think a lot of economics has tended to drive out the sense that people find meaning in their work apart from the material value and the benefit that it brings to them materially. And that is often ignored as part of the economic calculus, the economic equation. And so that needs to be reflected upon as well. I don't want to make this just a one-sided story that it's all the theologians and the church's problem. There's problems on both sides of the street, but you cannot, in my estimation, do theology about the broader world, about the economic issues in the world, without having the tools to be able to evaluate those broad economic structures, to be able to look at those numbers, to discern what they mean and don't mean, and be able to process that. And that's where the discussion is broken down. It seems to me that there's very little productive discussion in that area.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me that if we're going to, and there are issues concerning economics, there are issues concerning, labor, and as you talked about, environmental issues.
Right.
But you can't really have a good discussion on that if you don't have some understanding of economics. And,
right.
And especially, it seems in some ways the church is about 200 years behind, and that we haven't really figured out how to talk about the economy today as opposed to what economies were like for most of human history until maybe 2 or 3 centuries ago.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. And I, from a personal perspective, in terms of comparisons, I know that a lot of people in more progressive churches get exasperated with more conservative Christians on issues like evolution. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, the Bible doesn't talk, that's not what the first chapters of Genesis are about. They're not about evolution. They are not about origins per se, and they don't trust the scientists in terms of what's being said there. They just dismiss them out of hand. They hear conservative people say, well, the scientists are all materialists, so why should we believe what they're saying anyway? And we believe the Bible, that type of thing. So they get really frustrated, irritated with these conservative Christians, and they often will bring proof texts, these conservative Christians proof texts to prove these things, that the world was created in 6 days, so on and so forth. Well, for me, with what I know about economics, in the progressive world, it almost feels like exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's the proof texting from scripture, these things against capitalism or against, market trade, and looking, well, the people in Acts, they all, sold all their goods and they lived together in common. Just taking these little snippets and stories and putting them as proof texts against whatever it is that you don't like. And why don't they believe what's being said by economists? Well, those economists, they're all evil materialists, so we can't believe what they're saying. And it's the same thing that conservatives say about scientists when they're talking about evolution. So there needs to be that conversation, not a capitulation, a conversation between the two streams of thought. I think that's the issue. Yeah.
I hate bringing this up because I know it's going to be used, or it makes me sound like I'm a crank in some ways, but what influence is Marxism have with how people look at economics, especially within progressive churches? And, I am hesitant to bring that up because that's such an easy go-to answer, especially from a conservative side. But it seems like some of what we're talking about sounds like Marxism, but I'm not certain.
Yeah. Well, my thoughts on that are, and this goes back to my studies in sociology. In sociology, they talk about there's these large macro theories of how society works. And the two big sort of schools of thought in sociology sort of go in two different directions. One was called functionalism. And functionalism tries to look at how all the various pieces of society all fit together and interlock and support each other, and how it keeps society stable and keeps it perpetuating and keeps it running. And that's really fine, except many of those theories have a hard difficulty explaining about why disruption occurs, about why conflict develops, that type of thing. So where does that come from? They often have difficulty explaining it. The other school of thought was often what's called conflict theory. And conflict theory comes from Marxian ideas, the idea that there tend to be groups of people in society, classes, whatever you want to call them, that have vested interests, who have interlocking vested interests, who then seek to perpetuate their power relative to other people's power in society. And so you can look at how society is structured because by looking at these competing groups, they're in conflict with each other. And so you can analyze it and you can see why conflict continually develops, why there's constant disruption. But the downside of that one is, so how is the societies able to keep perpetuating themselves over time? How is it that they manage to keep order, that they actually survive and thrive over time? And so both of those two theories have merit in the way that they come at things, but either one by themselves ends up having problems with trying to explain the whole situation. And so and I wouldn't call it Marxist. My language would be Marxian. It's Marxian thinking. Marxist, to me, I tend to think of Karl Marx and Lenin and revolutions and communism and all that type of stuff. But Marxian thinking is more generically the idea of seeing world as competing power groups, competing interest groups, competing with each other, and how they jockey back and forth in order to get power or to take power. And that's a legitimate lens through which to view how society works. And so the progressive wing of the church tends to rely, I think, more heavily on that sort of Marxian view of things, liberation theology and all the various topics. And there's merit in those, that they're not diminishing those, but that alone, without a larger vision for how society should be incorporated, how it should work, tends to be a rather weak view of being able to shape the world. And the conservative side of that is, again, just this thing. We can't have critical race theory and we can't talk about historic racism, and we can't, all those type of stuff, because racism is just what individuals do. Well, they want to make everything about the fact that, the world is all orderly, that it all works together, and these are just minor nuisances and annoyances off to the side that don't have a central role in how society plays. And so somewhere between those two extremes, I think, is where the truth is. And it's a matter of being able to hold those two in tandem. And with critical race theory, which is sort of a subsection of what I would call, conflict theory, critical theory. I like somebody recently said, critical race theory is not a noun, it's a verb. It is a way of looking at something. It's a lens through which to view things. It's not a particular set of truths that are hanging together about a particular topic. It's a lens through which you use to look at something. And as long as that is taken as a lens, an important lens, not the only lens, I think there's truth to be learned through that. And so I think that's the progressive church has a contribution to make in terms of helping us understand how the world is there. But I think it's Scott McKnight who always used the phrase, it's true, but it's not true enough. So that's the way I'd frame it. Yeah.
So how do you improve things? How do you, one of the things I'm always fascinated with is, again, going back to kind of the science is, interviews I've seen about with Francis Collins, who is the outgoing head of the NIH, National Institutes of Health, who is a devout evangelical Christian. And he talks a lot about his faith and science and how those two can go together. Do we have any kind of any type of equivalent with economists that are, very much economists, but then also talk about their faith as well?
Yeah. I have found very few people over my years that I would say are truly competent in both spheres, in theology and economics. There have been some theologians that I have read who've written some books about economics, which I think are very helpful. I think they're very insightful, but they aren't truly economists in the true sense of that word. There is, trying to think of, do I have, trying to see. Yeah, Paul Heine, Heyne, is somebody that I recommend people read. Now, he died about 20 years ago, but he was a theologian who also had a degree in economics. And he has some very interesting writing and reflecting on those. And I think he even wrote an economics textbook that was used at college level. So, I mean, he was very well versed in both those topics. Daniel Finn is I think he's Catholic, but he, I think, has written some very good books about how we think about markets and the philosophy behind that, the thinking of it. And so there's a number of different angles on which to do this. But my experience has been it really is like you have to hunt these people down. I know that there's a Christian Economics Association that are economists that are Christians that get together and they have these conferences, and I see these small networks. But is there to the degree that we have Christians that are scientists that have a form associations that are having an impact on the culture? I do not see that in terms of economics at that level to this day. I think we see a lot more conversation looking at pastors and theologians looking at business people and thinking about business and how to integrate that aspect of life. But economics per se, there are pockets, but it's not a strong influence. Yeah.
So what are the results of this kind of paucity of really thinking about economics from a theological standpoint? How does it affect those of us in the church that we don't have this kind of fuller understanding of economics and how it applies to our faith?
Good question. Well, I think the issue is whether we are intentional about it or not, we are always being formed. something is forming us as we go through our lives. And so if we are not intentional in our thinking about economics and faith, then if we're not intentional about it, then something is going to form us. Mm-hmm. And I think what we typically see in the church is that what forms us are the prevailing populisms in the culture. That's what tends to form who the church is. So the question then becomes, how do we become more intentional about thinking about these issues and thinking more holistically about what that is? I don't have a strong answer for how we do that. I think it becomes a movement of some kind. I think most movements begin with a handful of people slowly making disciples and building a snowball effect until things begin to change. But as you and I know, I think we've had this conversation before, building a snowball towards moderation. the snowball is much easier to build if you got an extreme, overly confident sort of view of things, and you can attract people that much more easily. But trying to build that snowball towards something that is more holistic and more thoughtful is a bigger challenge. Mm-hmm. And I guess to some degree, it's very possible that may always be a minority take on the world, that there are always going to be people that are on the extremes of things, and that this moderating voice in the middle is the prophetic voice sometimes. It isn't the one that everybody's embracing, and you aren't exactly going to be received well or applauded when you speak out and are critical. So it's possible that's the case as well.
Looking at the other side, on kind of from an evangelical standpoint, and this is not all evangelicals, but some, is that there's almost you don't really question the economy at all.
Right.
It's just kind of, as you said earlier, it's, capitalism's great and there's no problems. And so I think the question there is, what is the fear of being critical? Because it seems like there's a fear there that if you criticize, then you're basically just throwing out all of capitalism and, let's bring in socialism. And that's not necessarily the case, or at least, it doesn't have to be the case.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I think part of the thing is, I think that we are living globally through unprecedented change in how the world is configured. I think we're going through something possibly as big globally as the Reformation was in Europe back in the 1500s. That is that disruptive. There's a book, I think his name Brent Waters, who wrote a book called Just Capitalism, and where he's looking at capitalism, the issue of globalization. And I like his characterization of things, that the nation states have been the dominant powers in the world in recent decades and recent lifetimes. But he sees in the 21st century us moving to market states, which become sort of global market regions that develop these interchanging reciprocal relationships that begins to diminish the power of the nation states to some degree, and tends to become more focused in these global international relationships, not globalism or one world government per se, but just something that spans simple nation states. And that creates challenges. There's Anthony Giddens writing 25 years ago. He talks about, on the one hand, globalization is consolidating the world. It's homogenizing it. All the economies are beginning to operate the same way because they all become interrelated. They have fairly close relationships in terms of property laws, how markets occur, and that type of thing. Not identical, but becoming more closely the same. But at the same time that it's homogenizing the world in terms of the economy, it's also blowing up cultures all around the world. Because as people become more prosperous, as information begins to flow, you have the internet. Voices that have long been silenced and haven't been heard now have a voice. They can have their voice heard. And just the economy changing itself causes dislocations, creating destructions, destroys jobs in some places, it creates jobs in other places. And so that kind of sort of chaos that begins to develop, one, suddenly I'm pressed in by all these different cultures and different views that I never had to deal with before. And now my life economically has become more unstable, and I'm more fearful of that, creates anxiety within the culture. Mm-hmm. And so I think this idea then becomes to latch onto those things in the past that we idealize as having been the parts that we valued the most, and somehow clinging to those and trying to preserve those and keep those and to re-energize them, those things that we saw in the past. And so I think what you see in this sort of reactionary, sort of evangelical movement is people sensing, without necessarily precisely understanding what it is, that something is changing, that the ground is shifting under their feet, and it's unnerving. And there's this wanting to cling to somebody who can assure them that everything's going to be fine and that they're going to take out all the people who threaten them. Mm-hmm. So I think there's that part of the equation. And in another part of the world, another community of the world, they're ready to tear it all down. We'll just have globalization, and we're ready to just open everything up, and que sera, whatever's going to be is going to be, and that's what. And so then those are the conflicts. And Anthony Giddens, writing 25 years ago, was suggesting that is the new fault line going forward in the 21st century, is this sense of how globalization is disrupting the world and how we accommodate it. So I think the American expression of that, with American evangelicalism and this real reactionary response, that's our particular outworking of that. But I think if you go to India, I think if you go to Eastern Europe, I think if you go to places, Brazil, you go to various places, you'll see the same dynamic working in similar ways with their own cultural expression. So, yeah. Hmm.
So let's actually move to something somewhat related, and that is the role of business and the church. And we don't talk as much or think as much about people who maybe they're the owner of a small business, or they work in finance or something. And this probably even brings up more to the larger question of work, is that it doesn't seem to me that we really take our theology into work.
Yeah.
It seems like it's these days just kind of happens on Sunday.
Yeah.
But we don't really move into Monday.
Right.
And I've seen that especially in progressive circles. I don't know if that's happening as much in evangelical circles, but what's going on with that we don't seem to, that work doesn't seem to matter as much to people, or at least to the church.
Right. Yeah. That's a good question. And I think this goes back again to the larger narrative of what are we here for? What has God put us here for? What has God put us here to do? And I think the narrative that most of us live by, most of us have been taught, is incomplete and is not robust enough that it helps us incorporate our work life into that Christian sense of calling and vocation. If you go back and look at Genesis 1, talks about basically human beings being set up as the vice regents over creation. They are God's basically princes and princesses working to be able to create the world, to bring it more fully into existence. And at the end of the scripture in Revelation, we talk about all of the treasures of humanity from the various races and tribes are all brought into the New Jerusalem. They are incorporated into this new city, the city that's now in the garden. And so there seems to be this sort of progression that humanity exists to bring the earth to its fullness, to bring humanity to its fullness, that there is a thing developing that God is doing in the world, and that we are intimate and lead partners with God in bringing that reality about. That to me is the flow of what Scripture is about. But I don't think most people, if when I say this, I hear some people sort of give the intellectual nod. Yeah, That's right. But in the warp and woof of their being, do they experience their life as that? Is that what it's really about? I don't think that most people do. And I think there's two forces at work. I think that in the church, there it goes back to the things we were talking about before. Things have changed a lot in the past couple of 100 years. And this issue of work and economics and wealth and how does it work into my life has become a much more complicated and different picture. And the church has not reflected adequately enough on what that means and what narrative would help us interpret that. And the other side is that in economics, this idea that faith matters shouldn't be brought into the business place. The business operates by its own rules and has its own sense of logic and reason to it. And trying to bring all these ethics and religion into it is a corrupting influence. And so therefore we try to teach people not to bring their faith into the workplace. So on the one hand, you have the culture saying you can't bring your faith to the workplace. And at church, we're just not going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about faith. And so what ends up happening is people end up having very compartmentalized lives. And church just becomes an adjunct to what they do in their real lives every day, which is at work. And in fact, one of the things that I find interesting is our church had some very difficult conversations over the past decade or so at various times. And almost every time we had families and individuals that decided to leave the church and go somewhere else. And in some of those, the written letters that they had, the theme was something to this effect. I come to church as my refuge, as my place to get away from all these controversies that everybody's talking about at work and culture and stuff like that. And I don't need to have those at church. I come to church to be renewed and to be made to feel whole again so I can go back out to the world. And so, and pastors hear that. Pastors know that that's some of what's going on with people in their congregation. And so that's a difficult thing for pastors. I don't want to put this all on pastors that it's just them ignoring things. What's the Woody Allen at the end of Annie Hall? He's talking to the psychiatrist. He says, "Doc," he says, "you got to help me. I got this friend who thinks he's a chicken." And he says, "Well, have you told him that he's not a chicken?" He says, "No, because I need the eggs." That's kind of how, to me, it seems like the church has developed in terms of dealing with the world of work and how it fits into our vocation, is that we don't want to be confronted with difficult questions, and pastors just want the church to go along smoothly. And so we're just not going to talk about this much. And I think it's sad because I think there are a lot of people that, though they have the initial resistance to some of these conversations, I think many of them have a deep longing for meaning in terms of what's happening in their daily lives, and they don't know how to connect and how to find it. And so trying to figure out how to have those difficult conversations, I think, in the life of the church is one of the challenges. Yeah.
And it seems like the danger of compartmentalizing your faith is that it might wall you off from, ethical concerns.
Right.
That you could end up doing some things that are unethical, but the church can't really speak to that anymore. And
Right.
I may be wrong on this, but I don't think I am. But if I remember when Enron was a big thing in the early 2000s, I believe one of the head honchos was a devout Baptist.
Yeah,
and
that's
yet
right.
was involved in all of this. And so you wonder, was he even taught to kind of wall off the church from what
Yeah.
was going on in the boardroom?
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. So, yeah, it has implications for business, for culture, for ethics, things that happen in our culture and how our culture develops. It has implications for the life of the church, because then the church ends up being captive to whatever is happening in the culture, because that's what's driving it. As I said before, you're being formed by something, whether it's intentional or not. And so the people that are in those pews are being formed by what the culture is telling them. If the church is not intentionally creating a counter narrative that gives alternate meaning to their life. So yeah.
I wanted to kind of change a little bit to was something you brought up earlier, and that is critical race theory.
Yeah.
Um, because that's obviously the topic we're all talking about. Um, Sometimes I wish we weren't talking about it.
But are we talking about it? The
Well,
question is
and that's the
about.
important thing, because I don't necessarily understand everything about it, and I think that there are some actual just criticisms of critical race theory. But
Oh yeah, yeah,
when people talk about it, I hear it and I keep thinking, do you even understand what this is all about? And for some
exactly.
reason, it's just even just anything that you talk about concerning race is just
Yep.
critical race theory. And so,
Right.
you know, what is kind of going on in our culture that we're just talking? There just seems to be a lot of anxiousness about,
Right.
these issues. And so critical race theory just becomes this kind of word that we use and toss around.
It's the boogeyman.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
what it is. It is a label, a concept on which you can throw all your anxieties and all your frustrations and anger at. And so my take is that what particularly the white folks that um, are sensitive toward the idea that racial prejudice still exists and that there are systemic issues involved in how race plays out in our culture, that is threatening to them. And so, and they see that, and so that is with every civil rights movement that's occurred over the past 100 years. The go-to thing is, well, that's Marxism, that's communism. This idea that there's systemic issues, and so critical race theory is Marxism. And then what we do is we throw anything that talks about systemic issues in terms of race into critical race theory. That all that is critical race theory. So racism is only what an individual um, believes and then acts on as an individual. That's all racism is. And so anything you want to say beyond that is this Marxist critical racism theory. So it is a way to deflect and to avoid having to think about and have a more nuanced view of American history and present American culture. And it's a reactionary response there. And like you said, yeah, there's, as I said earlier, critical race theory is a verb, not a noun. It's a lens through which to do it, and depending on who's got the lens, you're going to see a little bit different things with different, and some of them are wrong. Some of it's not substantiated, it's not valid. The lens itself is not necessarily the problem, but certain theorists and so on. But that's the way academia has always worked. Is that people take various lenses, they propose their views, then they debate them and they argue about them. They try to find truth. So the idea that critical, and most of these people who are wanting to ban critical race theory have no clue what critical race theory is. It's a fairly narrow, almost esoteric section of analysis of the law and how the law works to sometimes systemically deprive people of their status in society. But yeah, it has gone beyond something that's, when people are talking about critical race theory, they aren't talking about critical race theory. It's a boogeyman. Yeah.
So what is what's behind all of the anxiety? I because I don't want it. I guess for me, I don't, as an African American, I don't want to just easily say, well, you're just all racist, because I think that shuts down the discussion. I think
Right.
it's too simplistic.
Right.
But there is something there that wants to just make it just individual actions. But if it were just individual actions, then you would just deal with a few people and that's it. But
Yeah.
there wouldn't have been need for a civil rights movement or any of all the laws that were passed and all that. So
Exactly. Right.
what's the anxiety behind all of this?
Yeah. Well, I was having this conversation a couple times recently, looking back at my own personal experience and a couple generations in my life. So my dad is a World War II veteran, and he was in the last month of World War II, but he was in the Army for a couple years, and because of that, he was eligible for the GI Bill,
Mm-hmm.
and that GI Bill meant the housing, the the housing loans, guaranteed loans for veterans, and then also the college tuition. You could get college tuition because you were a veteran. And so when he came out of the Army, he went into college and he managed to go to college. He got tuition paid. And he bought several houses over those early years as he moved around and moved up to bigger houses, and always had VHA-backed loans at discounted rates in order to be able to buy those houses. And then eventually he became a professor. He went on to get his PhD, became a chemist, and he was a professor for 10 years, which happened to be at the time, overlapped the time that I went to college. And because he was a professor, I got my college tuition free because I was the son of one of the professors there. And then that has led on to the life that I've had and the decisions that I have made. Now go back to John Doe, who is a black man, who's the same age as my father, who served in World War II, and he comes out, and theoretically, he has the same GI Bill. He can go to college and have his college paid for, and he can get the VHA loan. Except that all throughout the United States, most black folks are restricted to certain neighborhoods, either implicitly or legally, and the VHA won't loan to houses that are in those neighborhoods because they're not considered quality housing. So the housing that you can participate in, you really can't take advantage of those VHA loans. College in the South, if you're a black person, you couldn't go to any of the state universities. And the black schools that were there tended to be focused more on religion, on teaching, on services, and that was about it. And not necessarily always the best quality in terms of instructors, that type of thing. There were some, but not necessarily. And then with the influx of people coming out after World War II, if you're going to have an influx of students, you have to put those students somewhere. And you are living in the racially segregated South where, there's only so much housing available. If you have an influx of students, where do you even put them if you did bring them to college? In the North, which is technically had black students, and they did in some colleges, but there was a quota. You could only have up to a certain number of people that were black people, so because that would deprive the white folks of the positions at those schools as well. So your ability to get that education and to build up your wealth by buying a house, and this is just one example of things that occurred over the 20th century. If a guy my age, your age, your parents, and therefore the circumstances that now shape your life were shaped by those events, and mine were shaped by my events. Did I do anything wrong? Did I do something terrible? Was I racist in order that what I did to get right?
I had a great time chatting with Michael, and I hope you were able to learn a thing or two. Before we sign off on this episode, I've just wanted to share a few things. The first is that we have a new email address. If you have a question or a comment, and even if you just want to say hello, and I would love that, you can send it to reverendpodcast@gmail.com. That's reverendpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. You can also consider subscribing to the show on your favorite podcast platform. I've named those platforms before. There are also a whole bunch of others that I'm not even aware of, but whichever one that you listen to, consider subscribing. Also, consider leaving a rating or review on your podcast platform, especially on Apple Podcasts /iTunes. Doing that makes it a lot easier for others to find this podcast. And right now, I think I have about 5 reviews. I would love if I had 10 in the next month or so. So if you are listening to this podcast, give a 5-star rating. That would be incredibly helpful for me. If you want to check out more, learn a little bit more about me, about the podcast, listen to some past episodes, don't forget to go to our website at enroutepodcast.org. That is it for this episode of En Route, a journey on religion and modern life. I am Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care and Godspeed.